In the last lecture, we talked about complex sentences, which were made up of a main clause and a subordinate clause. But in fact, there are different types of subordinate clauses, and in this part, we're going to look more closely at what they are and where you'll find them. A subordinate clause is a clause which fills a function either inside a phrase or inside another clause or sentence. There are three types of subordinate clauses. Relative clauses, which function as post modifiers in noun phrases. Complement clauses, which function as post modifiers in verb phrases. And adverbial clauses, which function as adverbials. We'll now look at each of these types in turn. A relative clause is a clause which is a post modifier in a noun phrase. In other words, it comes after the head noun and says something more about it. In the noun phrase, the man who lives across the street, who lives across the street is a clause which post modifies man. It says something more about the man. If you compare it to the man in the blue coat, which has a prepositional phrase in the post modifier position, then you can see that who lives across the street is doing the exact same thing as that prepositional phrase. It's sitting inside the noun phrase, modifying the head, man, and the whole chunk is a noun phrase which refers to a particular man. We can see that it's a noun phrase because we can use it as the subject of a clause. We can say, for example, the man who lives across the street works at the university. Here's another example. The book that I'm reading. Again, this whole thing is a noun phrase where book is the head and the clause that I am reading is in the post modifier position, telling us something more about the head. It's a relative clause. Again, we can see that the whole thing is a noun phrase because we could use it as the subject of a clause. The book that I'm reading is very good. Usually, relative clauses are introduced by a relative pronoun, either who, whom, which, or that. As in, the man who lives across the street, the man whom I met in the park, the book that I bought, or the car which speeded past our house. But you can't rely on there being a relative pronoun in order to figure out if something is a relative clause, because sometimes the relative pronoun can be left out. So instead of the man whom I saw, we could just say the man I saw. Instead of the book that I read in bed last night, we could just say the book I read in bed last night. What makes something a relative clause is not whether or not it's introduced by a relative pronoun, but whether it is a clause which sits in the post modifier position of the noun phrase. Since relative clauses are clauses, they can be analysed just like any other clause. Remember that all clauses have a subject and a predicate. So, for example, in the noun phrase, the book I read in bed last night, the relative clause is I read in bed last night. We can break this relative clause down into a subject and a predicate, like this. I is the subject, read in bed last night is the predicate. Which means that the whole noun phrase actually looks like this. In fact, we could break it down even more, because the verb phrase in the relative clause, read in bed last night, of course has an internal structure too, with a head and modifiers. Read is the main verb, so it's the head. In bed is a prepositional phrase which post modifies the head, and last night is a noun phrase which also post modifies the head. It's important to understand that subordinate clauses follow exactly the same rules as other clauses. They have a subject, which is a noun phrase, and a predicate, which is a verb phrase, and you can analyse those noun phrases and verb phrases in the exact same way as you would with an independent clause. You may notice that there seems to be something missing from this verb phrase. There's no noun phrase that tells you what it was that I read. And this is because the thing I read in this example is the head of the noun phrase that the relative clause is modifying. It's the book, as in the book I read in bed last night. Now, we can't repeat this object inside the verb phrase in the relative clause. We don't say, I read the book in bed last night. Instead, the object in a sense moves out of the relative clause and becomes the head of the noun phrase. If there is no other subject in the relative clause, then the relative pronoun functions as the subject. So in the man who lives across the street, the relative clause, who lives across the street, is analysed like this, where who is the subject noun phrase and lives across the street is the predicate. Remember that there are some verbs that need a noun phrase following them inside the verb phrase in order to form a predicate. We call these transitive verbs. But instead of a noun phrase, there are some verbs that need a clause following them in order to form a predicate. So for example, we can't just say, I think. There needs to be something more. For example, I think that he is lying. And we can't just say, she pretends. There needs to be something that she pretends to do. For example, she pretends that she doesn't understand what I'm talking about. A clause like this, which has to come after a verb in order to complete the meaning and make a predicate, is called a complement clause. Since it completes the meaning of the verb, and since the verb is the head of the verb phrase, a complement clause goes into the post-modifier slot of the verb phrase after the main verb. So in these examples, that he is lying post-modifies the verb think, and that she doesn't understand what I'm talking about post-modifies the verb pretends. Now notice that the whole complement clause is inside the verb phrase of another clause. And this is what makes it a subordinate clause. It's part of the structure of a larger clause, instead of being an independent clause of its own. Some complement clauses are introduced by a small word called a complementizer, which is that in these examples. I think that he is lying. She pretends that she doesn't understand what I'm talking about. But you can also have complement clauses without a complementizer and just say, I think he's lying. She pretends she doesn't understand what I'm talking about. So again, what makes something a complement clause is not being introduced by a complementizer, but being a clause that post-modifies the verb inside the verb phrase. There are some verbs, like think or pretend, that always have to have a complement clause following them. But there are also some verbs that can take either an object noun phrase or a complement clause, but have to have one or the other. So we could say, I want coffee, in which case coffee is a noun phrase, so it's an object. Or we could say, I want to go home. To go home is a clause post-modifying the verb, so it's a complement clause. I know the answer to that question. The answer to that question is a noun phrase post-modifying the verb know, so it's an object. I know that he did it. That he did it is a clause post-modifying the verb know in the verb phrase, so it's a complement clause. The third type of subordinate clause is called adverbial clauses. Adverbial clauses are clauses that function as adverbials, so they say something about when, where, how, or why the event of the main clause happens. The subordinate clauses that we looked at when we talked about complex sentences in the last lecture were all adverbial clauses. Here are some examples. When we had finished eating, we did the washing up. As she entered the room, she noticed something was missing. You will get good marks if you study hard. I can't come to class today because I'm ill. Adverbial clauses are introduced by subordinating conjunctions, such as when, as, if, or because in these examples. Now, we said that relative clauses could be introduced by a relative pronoun, and that one of the relative pronouns was that. We've also just said that complement clauses could be introduced by a complementizer, one of which is that. So how do you know whether it's one or the other? In fact, there are no less than 3 different that's in English. One is a demonstrative, as in that book over there. One is a relative pronoun, as in the book that I read. And one is a complementizer, as in I know that you did it. Now these words sound the same, but they're actually quite different in what they do. And here's how you tell them apart. If you can replace that with this, then it's a demonstrative. So instead of that book, we could say this book. If you can replace that with who or whom or which, then that is a relative pronoun. So instead of the book that I read, we could say the book which I read. But the relative pronoun can't be replaced by this. You can't say the book this I read. And if you can't replace that with either one of these, then that is a complementizer. So you can say I know that you did it, but you can't say I know this you did it, or I know who you did it. So this that, which can't be replaced by either one or the other, is a complementizer. To summarize, we've looked at 3 types of subordinate clauses. Relative clauses, which go in the post-modifier position of a noun phrase. Complement clauses, which go in the post-modifier position of a verb phrase. And adverbial clauses, which function as adverbials in a larger clause. You'll need to be able to identify these for your case study because we expect you to be able to analyze sentences that have more than one clause in them. We'll practice identifying and analyzing subordinate clauses in tutorials.